December 1943. Nazi spies stationed in America sent reports back to Berlin that were so unbelievable. German High Command initially dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Yet, General Motors was rolling out a completed B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour from their Willow Run factory. While Germany struggled to produce a dozen bombers per month, Americans were casually mass-producing the most sophisticated aircraft in the world at a rate that defied everything the Nazis thought they knew about industrial capacity. But how did this impossible American production miracle completely shatter the Nazi war machine's understanding of their enemy and ultimately seal their fate? In late 1943, the world was split in two by a terrible war. On one side stood Nazi Germany, where Adolf Hitler ruled with an iron fist. German cities sat in darkness each night, afraid of Allied bombers dropping death from above. Food was scarce, and people waited in long lines for their small portions of bread and meat. German factories struggled to build even basic weapons as raw materials became harder and harder to find. Across the Atlantic Ocean, America looked very different. The Great Depression had ended, and factories hummed with activity day and night. Workers drove their own cars to work, something that seemed impossible to most Germans. American families ate full meals while German children went to bed hungry. The contrast was stark, but few people in Germany knew the truth about America's growing strength. In the heart of Michigan sat a massive building that stretched for over a mile. The Willow Run plant belonged to General Motors, and it had been turned into something the world had never seen before. Henry Ford's assembly line ideas were being used to build not cars, but giant four-engine bombers called B-24 Liberators. These flying fortresses were the size of small buildings, weighing over 30 tons when fully loaded. Inside this factory, 40,000 American workers moved like parts of a giant machine. The building never slept. When the day shift went home, the night shift took over. Bright lights lit up every corner, and the sound of riveting and welding never stopped. Workers ate hot meals in clean cafeterias, drank ice-cold Coca-Cola from glass bottles, and earned good wages that let them buy homes and cars. But thousands of miles away, German spies were watching and counting. They hid in shadows near the factory gates, timing the movement of completed bombers as they rolled out of the massive building. What they saw seemed impossible. Every hour, on the hour, another gleaming B-24 emerged from those factory doors. The spies checked their watches again and again, certain they had made a mistake. These German agents had been trained to gather information about American war production. They expected to find a weak nation struggling to build weapons. Instead, they discovered an industrial giant that made their own country look small and poor. The reports they sent back to Berlin were so shocking that their handlers thought the spies had been caught and were sending false information. In dark offices in Nazi Germany, intelligence officers read these reports with growing disbelief. One bomber every hour? It was impossible. Germany's best factories could barely build one bomber per week. Yet the reports kept coming, each one more stunning than the last. Something was happening in America that would change the course of the war, but the Nazi leadership refused to believe it. The German spies could not believe their eyes as they watched the Willow Run factory operate like a perfectly timed clock. Every 60 minutes, without fail, another massive bomber rolled through those doors. The planes gleamed silver in the Michigan sunlight, their 4 propeller engines ready for war. The spies counted 24 bombers in a single day, more than most German factories could build in 6 months. During their lunch break, German workers back home stood in bread lines, hoping for a small loaf to feed their families. At Willow Run, American workers sat in bright cafeterias eating thick sandwiches, hot soup, and fresh fruit. The smell of coffee and apple pie filled the air while men and women laughed and talked about their weekend plans. These workers owned houses, drove cars, and sent their children to school with full lunchboxes. The parking lot outside the factory stretched for acres, filled with thousands of personal automobiles. In Germany, only the richest officials owned cars, while ordinary people rode bicycles or walked. Here in America, Factory workers drove to their jobs in shiny Fords and Chevrolets, machines that cost more than most Germans earned in 2 years. The sight made the spies feel sick to their stomachs. A red Coca-Cola truck rumbled up to the factory loading dock, filled with thousands of ice-cold bottles. The driver whistled a happy tune as he unloaded crate after crate of the sweet drink. In Germany, sugar was so rare that children had forgotten what candy tasted like. Yet here were American workers drinking sugary soda like water, tossing empty bottles into trash cans without a second thought. The spies watched night shift workers arrive in warm winter coats, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The factory blazed with light, every window glowing like a beacon. In German cities, people stumbled through dark streets, afraid to turn on lights that might attract enemy bombers. The contrast felt like comparing a palace to a cave. Inside the factory, the assembly line moved with incredible speed and precision. Workers attached wings to fuselages in exactly 18 minutes. Engines were mounted in 12 minutes flat. The whole process flowed like a river, each person knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. German factories were chaotic places where nothing worked on time and parts were always missing. The German agents began to understand a terrible truth. They had been told that America was weak, that democracy made people lazy and soft. Instead, they found a nation that built war machines faster than Germany could even count them. Their hands shook as they wrote reports that their superiors would never believe. Deep in their hearts, they started to wonder if their leaders had lied about everything. The American giant was not sleeping. It was wide awake, and it was angry. The moment that shattered everything came on a cold December morning, when the German spy, known as Agent Friedrich, watched his 100th bomber roll off the Willow Run assembly line. He had been counting for 4 days straight, sleeping in his car and eating stale bread. His notebook was filled with hash marks, each one representing a flying fortress that would soon drop bombs on his homeland. The numbers did not lie. 100 bombers in 100 hours. His hands trembled as he wrote the final mark. Friedrich had served the Nazi Party for 8 years. He believed in German superiority, in the strength of the fatherland, in the weakness of democratic nations. He had been taught that Americans were soft people who cared only about money and movies. Yet here he sat, watching the most powerful war machine in human history operate with the precision of a Swiss watch. The cognitive dissonance felt like a knife twisting in his brain. That afternoon, he followed a group of workers to a nearby diner for lunch. The smell of fried chicken and fresh biscuits made his mouth water. He had not tasted real meat in months. The workers ordered huge plates of food, enough to feed a German family for a week. They talked about baseball games and weekend fishing trips, while eating apple pie topped with real ice cream. One young man complained that his new car was making a funny noise. Another woman worried about which college her son should attend. These people lived in a world Friedrich could barely comprehend. The breaking point came when Friedrich overheard 2 workers discussing production numbers. The older man, a supervisor with calloused hands and kind eyes, was training a new employee. He explained that Willow Run was just one of many factories. Ford had another plant in River Rouge. Boeing was building bombers in Seattle. Consolidated Aircraft was working in San Diego. Each factory was producing hundreds of planes every month. The supervisor mentioned that America was building more bombers in 1 month than Germany had built in the entire war. Friedrich felt his world collapse like a house of cards. Everything he had believed about German strength was a lie. His country was not fighting a weak enemy. They were fighting an industrial giant that could build weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. The Nazi propaganda machine had fed him fairy tales while America prepared for total war. That evening, Friedrich sat in his hotel room and wrote a report that would change his life forever. His hands shook as he described what he had witnessed. He knew his superiors would think he had gone insane or been captured by the enemy. No rational person could believe that one factory was producing 24 heavy bombers every single day. But Friedrich had seen it with his own eyes, had counted each silver giant as it emerged from that mile-long building. He thought about his younger brother Hans, fighting in the frozen hell of the Russian front. Hans wrote letters about shortages of ammunition, broken equipment, and friends who died because their tanks ran out of fuel. Meanwhile, American workers drove home in their private cars to eat steak dinners and listen to jazz music on the radio. The contrast was so stark, it made Friedrich physically ill. As he sealed his report in an envelope, Friedrich realized he was no longer a true believer. The Nazi dream of world conquest was built on lies and wishful thinking. Germany was not the master race. They were David facing Goliath, except this time, Goliath had an endless supply of stones. The American industrial machine would grind the Third Reich into dust, one bomber at a time. Friedrich mailed his report and walked out into the cold Michigan night. Above him, the stars shone down on a nation that had awakened from its peaceful slumber. The sleeping giant was not just awake. It was building an air force that would darken the skies over Germany. Agent Friedrich returned to Germany in the spring of 1945, just as his homeland was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombs. The train that carried him home moved slowly through cities that looked like broken teeth. Berlin was a wasteland of rubble and ash, where hungry children searched through garbage for scraps of food. The contrast with America hit him like a physical blow. His superiors had ignored his reports about American bomber production. They called him a traitor and a fool. But now, those same bombers filled German skies every day, dropping tons of explosives on factories, bridges, and military bases. The B-24 Liberators he had watched roll off the Willow Run assembly line were now turning German cities into graveyards. Each plane that passed overhead reminded Friedrich of his terrible knowledge. Friedrich walked through the ruins of his childhood neighborhood, carrying a small suitcase and memories that felt like poison in his mind. The house where he grew up was gone, replaced by a crater filled with dirty water. His neighbors lived in basements and subway tunnels, their faces hollow from hunger and fear. These people had believed in Nazi promises of victory and glory. Instead, they got death from above, delivered by American workers who went home each night to eat hot dinners. At night, Friedrich would sit in the basement shelter and listen to the air raid sirens wail. He knew exactly how many bombers were coming because he had watched them being built. While German children cried in the darkness, he remembered American workers laughing in bright cafeterias, drinking Coca-Cola, and planning their summer vacations. The memory felt like a knife in his heart. Friedrich tried to tell people what he had seen in America, but nobody wanted to listen. They called him crazy when he described factories that built bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. They refused to believe that American workers owned cars and ate meat every day. The truth was too painful to accept, so they chose to live in their broken dreams. Years later, as Germany slowly rebuilt from the ashes, Friedrich would remember the lesson he learned in Michigan. He had discovered that freedom was not weakness, that democracy was not chaos, and that happy workers built better weapons than slaves ever could. The Nazi Party had taught him to hate America, but they had never taught him to understand it. Friedrich spent his remaining years trying to forget the sight of those silver bombers rolling off the assembly line, one every hour, day and night, until Germany surrendered. He had witnessed the true power of a free nation at war, and it was more terrible and beautiful than any propaganda could describe. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its industrial might had crushed the Third Reich like an insect under a boot. Democracy had won, not through speeches or parades, but through the simple act of building more bombers than the enemy could destroy.